The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a fine, determined mist that clung to the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor and blurred the edges of the sprawling, melancholic parkland beyond the carriage window. Ilara Vance pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the landscape dissolve into shades of gray and bruised purple. Inside the coach, the air was thick with the scent of her cousin Adelaide's expensive French perfume and the low hum of Adelaide's complaints about the damp. Ilara wore her mother's old dress. It was a deep blue wool, mended so carefully at the cuff that the stitches were nearly invisible, a testament to long hours by candlelight. The garment was her only armor against the evening to come, a fragile shield of memory and dignity against the certain scrutiny of the Duke's dinner table. They were here, at the formidable seat of the Duke of Alastair Beaumont, because Adelaide's mother believed her daughter's beauty and sizable dowry were the perfect cure for a grieving, reclusive nobleman. Ilara was merely a part of the baggage, a poor relation brought along to serve as a quiet, unassuming companion, a living shadow to make Adelaide's light shine all the brighter. She was expected to be present, but unseen, a silent figure in a plain dress, fulfilling her role by being utterly forgettable. She had long ago perfected the art of fading into the background, of making herself as small and unobtrusive as the worn book she often carried, its pages a silent retreat from conversations that never included her. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist not as a home, but as a fortress against the world. Its towers were stark silhouettes against the weeping sky, its windows dark and watchful. As they were ushered into the great hall, the sheer scale of the place seemed designed to diminish its inhabitants. Suits of armor stood like ghostly sentinels, their metal gleaming dully in the candlelight that did little to pierce the cavernous gloom. A severe-looking housekeeper with a face carved from granite, Mrs. Gable, greeted them with a curt nod and led them towards the drawing-room, her footsteps echoing on the black and white marble floor. The air was cold, carrying the scent of beeswax, old stone, and something else, a faint, lingering trace of sorrow. The drawing-room was a sea of muted silks and somber velvets. A dozen guests, all relatives or neighbors of impeccable standing, were arranged in stiff, formal clusters. At the center of this web of polite tension was a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes as sharp and unforgiving as chips of flint. This was Lady Beatrice Croft, the Duke's aunt, a woman who wielded social propriety like a weapon. Her gaze swept over Adelaide with measured approval, then slid to Ilara, lingering for a fraction of a second on the simple cut of her blue dress. The dismissal was so swift and absolute, it was almost a physical blow. Ilara felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks and forced it down, lifting her chin just enough to be polite, but not enough to be noticed. The Duke himself was the last to enter. He was not what Ilara had expected. The whispers in London society had painted him as a man broken by grief, a hollow shell. But the man who stood in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the room with a sudden, palpable weight. His hair was black, his face was a mask of aristocratic severity, but his eyes were ancient. They were dark, shadowed, and utterly weary, as if he had witnessed the turning of centuries and found them all wanting. He moved with a kind of dangerous stillness, a predator forced into a cage of social niceties. He offered a single clipped bow to the room, his gaze passing over everyone, including Adelaide's hopeful smile without a flicker of interest. Dinner was an ordeal of hushed reverence and unspoken cruelties. The dining room was vast, the table a polished ocean of mahogany reflecting the dozens of flickering candles from the silver candelabra. The conversation was a low, careful murmur, dominated by Lady Beatrice, who directed it with the precision of a field marshal. Ilara sat beside Adelaide, a silent island in the stream of talk about court gossip and impending marriages. She ate little, her hands clasped tightly in her lap beneath the heavy linen napkin. She focused on the details, the intricate pattern of the silverware, the way the candlelight caught in the cut crystal, the heavy silence that fell whenever the Duke shifted in his chair at the head of the table. It was during the fish course that Lady Beatrice turned her attention to her. "Miss Vance," she began, her voice carrying with crystalline clarity down the length of the table. "How very practical of you to wear wool. So sensible for a country evening." The word practical was layered with a dozen unspoken insults, each one sharper than the last. It meant plain. It meant poor. It meant you do not belong here. A ripple of amusement, quickly suppressed, went through the guests. Adelaide shifted uncomfortably, a faint blush of embarrassment for her cousin staining her cheeks. Ilara met the older woman's gaze directly. The instinct to shrink, to apologize, to simply disappear, was a physical ache in her chest. But then she thought of her mother, her fingers patiently working the needle, her quiet voice telling her that character was the only cloth that could never be frayed or torn. She inclined her head. "It was my mother's," she replied, her own voice low but steady. "She always valued warmth over ornamentation, my lady, a lesson I find more useful with each passing year." The response was simple, honest, and utterly devoid of the artifice Lady Beatrice expected. It offered no weakness to exploit. For a moment, the flinty eyes of the Duke's aunt narrowed, surprised by the lack of a flinch. Then, with a dismissive sniff, she turned away, the moment over. Across the vast expanse of mahogany, Ilara felt a gaze settle upon her. She did not need to look up to know it was the Duke. It was not a look of pity, nor of amusement. It was something else entirely. Appraisal. A quiet, intense observation that seemed to cut through the noise of the room and see, for the first time, the woman in the simple blue dress. She felt it like a physical touch, a sudden pressure in the quiet room. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her heart hammering against her ribs. But she could not escape the unnerving sensation of being truly seen. He had not spoken a single word to her, yet in that one prolonged glance, a silent conversation had begun. The woman who was supposed to be invisible had, in her quiet act of defiance, captured the attention of the one man everyone else was trying so desperately to impress. When the ladies retired to the drawing room, leaving the men to their port, the air grew thick with a cloying sweetness. Ilara felt suffocated by the whispers, the rustle of silk, the weight of 100 tiny judgments. She needed to breathe. Slipping from the room under the pretense of admiring a tapestry in the hall, she made her escape. The corridors of Blackwood Manor were a labyrinth of shadows and silence. She walked without a destination, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick runners. She was drawn by an instinct she did not understand towards a heavy oak door, slightly ajar, a sliver of warm, golden light spilling from within. It was the library. The scent of old paper and leather washed over her, a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. The room was magnificent, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books, their spines a rich tapestry of color and gold leaf. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting dancing shadows across the room. On a massive desk near the fire, a heavy ledger lay open, a chaotic sea of ink and numbers. An inkwell was uncapped, a quill resting beside it as if its user had been interrupted mid-thought. Her father, before his fortunes had failed, had been a merchant. He had taught her the language of numbers, the clean and honest logic of a balanced account. She had loved it, the way order could be wrought from chaos, the simple truth a column of figures could tell. Drawn by an old and familiar comfort, she moved closer to the desk. She did not touch anything, but her eyes scanned the page. The handwriting was bold and impatient, but the figures themselves were a mess. She saw it almost immediately, a transposition of numbers in a crucial column, a simple error that threw the entire summary into disarray. A quiet murmur escaped her lips, a whispered correction. It should be 954, not 945. The carryover is wrong. Is it now? The voice came from the deep shadows near the fireplace. It was low and resonant, laced with a weary irony. Ilara started, her hand flying to her throat as the Duke stepped out of the darkness. He had not gone to the drawing room with the other men. He stood there, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching her. In the firelight, the harsh lines of his face were softened, and the exhaustion in his eyes was starkly visible. She felt a flush of mortification, caught like a common thief. "Your Grace," she stammered, stepping back from the desk. "Forgive me, I should not be here." He took a slow step forward, his gaze fixed not on her face but on the open ledger. "You were correcting my accounting." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a faint, surprising note of curiosity. "Most ladies who find their way in here are more interested in the poetry." The mortification receded, replaced by a flicker of her earlier resolve. He was not angry, merely observant. She straightened her shoulders slightly. "Poetry has its place, Your Grace, but it will not balance a budget." She gestured hesitantly towards the page. "The error is here, in the summary of the tenant's quarterly rents. It throws off the entire projection for the year." She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who knew her subject, her earlier nervousness forgotten in the face of a problem that needed solving. Alistair moved to stand beside her, looking down at the ledger. He was so close she could feel the heat from his body, could smell the faint scent of rain and smoke that clung to his coat. He studied the numbers for a long moment, his dark brows furrowed in concentration. Then he let out a quiet breath. "So it is." He picked up the quill, dipped it in the ink, and with a swift, decisive stroke, corrected the figure. He did not look at her, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere between them. The social chasm of Duke and poor relation had momentarily vanished, replaced by two minds focused on a single, logical point. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. The weariness was still there, but it was joined by something new, a spark of genuine interest. "You have a clear eye for figures, Miss Vance." "My father was a merchant," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "Was he?" The Duke's gaze held hers, searching for something she could not name. "He taught you well." He did not smile, but the hard line of his mouth seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. He remembered her name. In a room full of brightly colored, chattering birds of paradise, he had remembered the name of the quiet wren in the corner. Not because of her family or her face, but because she had seen a flaw in his numbers. He remembered her for her mind. As she curtsied and made her quiet exit from the library, Ilara knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her life had just irrevocably changed. She had come to Blackwood Manor expecting to be invisible, and had left the library as the only person the Duke truly seemed to see. The days that followed the dinner party settled into a strange and quiet rhythm. Adelaide, bored by the Duke's continued indifference and the incessant rain, spent most of her time writing letters or sleeping late. Lady Beatrice, having made her point, largely ignored Ilara, relegating her once more to the status of a piece of furniture. But for Ilara, the oppressive stillness of Blackwood Manor was now charged with a secret current of anticipation. The library had become a sanctuary, a silent promise. 2 days after their encounter, a footman delivered a note to her room. The paper was thick and creamy, the handwriting the same bold, impatient script from the ledger. It was not an invitation, but a command, albeit a politely phrased one. "Miss Vance, your assistance in the library at 3 o'clock would be appreciated. Beaumont." She read the words 3 times. her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It was improper. It was unexpected. It was everything. At precisely 3 o'clock, she entered the library. The Duke was already there, seated at the massive desk which was now covered in a chaotic mountain of ledgers and papers. He did not rise, but gestured to a chair opposite him. "Miss Vance." The greeting was formal, his expression unreadable. "I find myself in need of a second opinion, one that is not clouded by sentiment or self-interest." He pushed a smaller ledger across the polished surface of the desk. "The household accounts. They do not make sense to me." And so it began. Their afternoons fell into a pattern, a quiet ritual enacted away from the prying eyes of the household. The library became their world, a space defined by the scent of leather, the crackle of the fire, and the soft scratch of quill on paper. He would present her with a problem: discrepancies in the accounts for the home farm, confusing invoices from London suppliers, the spiraling costs of the stables, and she, with her quiet, methodical mind, would unravel it. She would sit for hours, tracing the flow of numbers, her brow furrowed in concentration, and then, in her low, clear voice, she would explain the discrepancy, the oversight, the inefficiency. He rarely spoke while she worked, but he watched. Ilara was intensely aware of his gaze, a steady, unnerving pressure. He did not watch her as a man watches a woman. He watched her mind at work. He seemed fascinated by the process, by the way her fingers would trace a line of figures, the way she would bite her lip when puzzling over a difficult entry. In these moments, she was not Ilara Vance, the poor relation. She was a skilled professional, respected for her competence. It was a feeling so new and so intoxicating that it frightened her. Their conversations slowly began to drift from the arid language of numbers. He would find her reading a book from the shelves and ask her opinion on it. They discovered a shared love for the Stoic philosophers, for histories of far-off lands. He spoke of his travels before his brother's death, of the heat of Italy and the cold, clear light of the northern seas. She spoke of the books her father had given her, of the small world she had built for herself within their pages. She learned that the cold mask he wore was a shield, forged in the fires of grief and betrayal. His older brother, it turned out, had not just been a spendthrift. He had been a reckless gambler, leaving the Beaumont estate teetering on the brink of ruin. Alistair had inherited not just a title, but a catastrophe. "He trusted everyone," Alistair said one afternoon, his voice flat and devoid of emotion as he stared into the fire. "Especially those who flattered him most. I am the opposite." He did not look at her, but the confession hung in the air between them. It was an explanation, and perhaps an apology for his own guarded nature. It was the first time he had offered her a glimpse into the wound he carried, and the trust implied by the gesture was more precious than any jewel. One evening, they were working later than usual. A storm had broken outside, the rain lashing against the tall library windows, the wind howling in the chimneys. The rest of the house was silent, asleep. The only light came from a cluster of candles on the desk, casting a small, intimate pool of gold in the vast darkness of the room. A stack of ledgers was piled precariously between them. Ilara reached for the topmost one, the book of rents she had first corrected, to cross-reference a figure. At the exact same moment, Alistair reached for it as well, intending to move it out of her way. Their hands met. His fingers closed over hers, his touch surprisingly warm against her cool skin. It was an accident, a simple, unintentional collision in the candlelight. But the effect was electric. A jolt went through Ilara, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, the strength and warmth of his hand covering hers, the rough texture of his skin against the back of her knuckles, the sound of the storm, the crackle of the fire, the very scent of the room. It all faded away. He did not pull back immediately. For a long, breathless moment, his hand remained over hers on the worn leather cover of the book. She dared to look up, her eyes meeting his across the flickering candles. The mask was gone. In his gaze, she saw not the weary duke or the calculating landowner, but a man, startled and vulnerable. She saw a flicker of the same shock she felt, and something deeper, something that looked like a long-starved man gazing at a feast. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with everything they had never said. It was not the silence of the dinner table, which had been born of tension and disapproval, but the silence of two souls recognizing each other in a quiet room, a silence more profound than any words. Then, as slowly as he had touched her, he withdrew his hand. The spell was broken. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping back to the papers, but the air was irrevocably changed. The space between them now hummed with a new and dangerous energy. "It is late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You should get some rest." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a retreat. As Alara gathered her shawl and slipped from the room, the feeling of his hand on hers lingered like a brand. It was a touch that promised nothing, and yet hinted at everything, a fleeting connection that had laid bare the truth of the quiet hours they had spent together. It was no longer about numbers. It had not been for a very long time. The Duke's wards, Leo and Clara, were like small, pale ghosts haunting the grand corridors of Blackwood Manor. Since the death of their parents, they had become withdrawn and silent, their childish spirits seemingly crushed by the weight of the enormous, quiet house. Their governess, a Miss Finch appointed by Lady Beatrice, was a woman whose philosophy on child-rearing centered on rigid schedules and the suppression of all unseemly emotion. Laughter was a disruption. Questions were an impertinence. Alara first encountered the children in the neglected rose garden. She had sought refuge there one afternoon, needing a respite from the library's intense atmosphere. She found them huddled together on a stone bench, Clara, who was barely 6, quietly weeping into her older brother's shoulder. Leo, a solemn boy of 8, was trying to fix a small wooden bird whose wing had snapped off. He was clumsy with the task, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. Miss Finch was nowhere to be seen. Alara approached them slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. Leo looked up, his eyes wide and suspicious, pulling his sister closer. Clara's sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths. Alara did not press them. Instead, she gestured to the broken toy. "May I see? My father was very good at mending things. He taught me a little." Hesitantly, Leo held out the fractured bird. Alara took it gently. From a small sewing kit she always carried in her pocket, a habit born of a lifetime of making do, she retrieved a tiny roll of waxed thread and a needle. With patient, careful movements, she bound the delicate wing back into place, securing it with a series of knots so tiny and precise they were almost invisible. She handed the bird back to Leo. He stared at it, turning it over and over in his small hands. The wing was firm. He looked from the bird to Alara, a flicker of wonder in his solemn eyes. Clara crept a little closer, peering at Alara from behind her brother's arm. "How did you do that?" she whispered. "It just takes a little patience," Alara said with a small smile. "And knowing where the break is weakest." From that day on, the garden became another of her sanctuaries, but one she now shared. She would find the children there, and they would talk. She read to them from her own worn copy of Aesop's fables, her voice calm and soothing. She taught them the names of the flowers her mother had loved, the climbing roses, the lavender, the columbine. She did not try to replace their mother. She simply offered them a consistent, gentle presence, an island of warmth in their cold, orderly world. Alistair began to notice the change. He found his wards in the library one afternoon, a place they had always avoided. They were not reading, but sitting on a rug by the fire, listening, utterly rapt, as Ilara told them a story she was inventing on the spot, about a brave mouse and a grumpy badger who lived in the manor's walls. There was a faint flush on Clara's cheeks, and Leo even let out a small, stifled laugh. When they saw the Duke, they fell silent, the old caution returning to their eyes, but they did not scurry away as they usually did. They looked from him to Ilara, as if seeking permission to remain. He said nothing, merely retreating to his desk, but he watched them from over the top of his papers. He saw the way Clara instinctively leaned against Ilara's arm. He saw the way Leo's guarded expression softened as she resumed her story in a lower voice. He saw in her a natural, unforced kindness that was as rare and valuable as the integrity she had shown with his accounts. She was not just ordering his finances, she was mending the broken pieces of his family. And this, more than anything, began to terrify him. She was becoming essential. Lady Beatrice was not a woman to be trifled with, and her powers of observation were formidable. She saw the flickers of life returning to the children, the way they sought out the poor relation. She saw the closed library door, the lamps burning late into the night. She saw the way her nephew, the Duke, had lost some of the brittle, angry edge he had carried since his brother's death, replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity that was always directed at one person. She saw it all, and she did not approve. Her campaign against Ilara began with the subtlety of a surgeon's scalpel. It started with comments dropped like poison into the drawing room conversation. Such a shame about the Vance family's misfortunes. It must be so difficult for the girl, having to make her way in the world. Some are tempted to take shortcuts. The implication was clear, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of society gossip. Next, she attempted to reclaim the territory Ilara had won. She began to make a great show of visiting the nursery, bringing expensive but impersonal gifts for the children. A doll with a porcelain face too perfect to be played with, a book of dense moral instruction. The children received them with polite silence, their eyes remaining fixed on the door, waiting for Ilara. Beatrice's attempts at affection were stiff and unnatural, and the children, with the unerring instinct of the young, recoiled from it. Her failures only hardened her resolve and sharpened her animosity towards the cause of her defeat. She tried to block Ilara's access to the Duke. She would invent urgent tasks for Adelaide that required Ilara's immediate assistance. "Ilara, dear, Adelaide's hem has come down. You are so clever with a needle." She would schedule fittings with dressmakers or arrange tedious afternoon calls, all designed to keep Ilara occupied and away from the library during her customary hours. But the Duke was a step ahead. His notes would simply arrive with a new time, 6 o'clock this evening, or after breakfast tomorrow. Her efforts were like building a dam of sand against the determined tide. The confrontation, when it came, was direct. Lady Beatrice found Ilara in the hallway, returning a volume of Marcus Aurelius to the library. The old woman stood before her, blocking her path, her back ramrod straight. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice devoid of its usual social polish. "A word of advice. A wise mouse knows not to play in the lion's den. She will get eaten." Ilara met her gaze without flinching. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, steady anger. "A wise lion, my lady," she countered, her voice soft but firm, "knows the difference between a mouse and someone who is simply trying to clean the cage." A flicker of disbelief, then fury, crossed Beatrice's face. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered less than nothing. "You are presumptuous, you are a penniless nobody, and you are playing a very dangerous game. Do not imagine for a second that a little skill with numbers gives you any standing here. You are a temporary amusement. Do not forget your place. or I shall be forced to remind you of it in a way you will not enjoy." She turned on her heel and swept away, leaving Elara standing in the silent corridor, her heart pounding. The threat was no longer veiled. The battle lines had been drawn. Lady Beatrice was done with subtlety. She now sought total victory, and Elara was the sole object of her war. The crisis arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the rustle of paper. It had been brewing for weeks in the quiet of the library. Elara, in her methodical review of the estate's accounts, had uncovered a pattern of discrepancies too consistent to be accidental. Small amounts, siphoned from various accounts, the purchase of feed for the stables, repairs to tenant farms, supplies for the household, all approved by the estate steward, a man named Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher had been with the family for 20 years, appointed by Lady Beatrice's late husband, and was considered a paragon of loyalty. The amounts were small enough to go unnoticed in a casual review, but when aggregated over years, they represented a staggering sum. It was a slow, patient, and devastating bleed. When Elara presented her findings to Alistair, his face had become a mask of cold fury. He had not seemed surprised, merely confirmed in a long-held, unspoken suspicion. He had simply nodded, taken the papers from her, and said, "Thank you, Miss Vance. Leave this with me." His calmness was more terrifying than any outburst. She had felt a chill, a sense that she had unearthed something far more dangerous than just financial fraud. Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, was preparing her own offensive. She had learned from a gossiping maid that Elara was not merely advising the Duke, but had been given free rein over the estate's most sensitive financial documents. This was the ultimate transgression, the proof she needed of the girl's cunning and manipulation. She decided to stage her attack in the most public forum possible, a small ball she had insisted on hosting at Blackwood to lift the spirits of the house. It was the perfect theater for a public execution. The ballroom, which had been shrouded in dust cloths for over a year, was ablaze with light. Music from a small string quartet drifted through the air, but it could not dispel the underlying tension. Elara, wearing her same blue dress, for she had no other, felt more out of place than ever. She stood near the edge of the room, watching the dancers, a solitary figure in a sea of glittering jewels and vibrant silks. Adelaide had found a willing dance partner and had abandoned her at the first opportunity. Lady Beatrice waited until there was a lull in the music. She moved to the center of the room, her silver gown shimmering, and clapped her hands for attention. A hush fell over the guests. "My dear friends," she began, her voice ringing with false warmth, "and my dear nephew." She turned to Alistair, who was standing near the French doors, his expression thunderous. "I am afraid I must interrupt this lovely evening to address a matter of some delicacy." Her eyes, cold and triumphant, found Elara in the crowd. She pointed a jeweled finger. "It has come to my attention that this young woman, Miss Vance, has been given a position of quite extraordinary trust in this household." A murmur went through the guests. "She has been allowed access to the ducal finances, a role for which she has neither the training nor, I fear, the character." Beatrice's voice rose, filled with righteous indignation. "I have it on good authority that she has been meddling, confusing the accounts, and using her position to manipulate my grieving nephew for her own gain. It is the oldest and saddest of stories. An opportunistic little fortune hunter, preying on a good man's sorrow." She took a step towards Elara, her face a mask of contempt. "I accuse her of gross misconduct and of attempting to defraud this family. I demand that she be sent from this house tonight in disgrace." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Every eye in the room was on Elara. She stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. The cruelty of the attack was breathtaking. It was one thing to be insulted, another to be publicly branded a thief and a predator. She felt the floor drop away from beneath her. She had a wild urge to run, to flee the hatred in Beatrice's eyes and the curious, condemning stares of the guests. But then, a voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp as breaking ice. "That is enough, Aunt." Alistair moved from the shadows of the doorway into the center of the room. He did not raise his voice, but its quiet authority commanded the attention of every person present. He came to a stop not beside his aunt, but a few paces in front of Elara, creating a physical barrier between her and the rest of the room. A protector. "You accuse Miss Vance of meddling," he said, his dark eyes fixed on Beatrice's stunned face. "You are mistaken. Miss Vance was not meddling. She was working under my direct instruction." He let that statement settle in the quiet room before continuing. "For some time I have suspected financial irregularities in the management of this estate. My own investigations were fruitless. The deception was too skillfully hidden. I required an outside perspective, an eye for detail unclouded by years of misplaced trust." His gaze swept the room, cold and assessing. "Miss Vance, with her remarkable and honest talent for numbers, has succeeded where I failed. She has uncovered a systematic theft from this estate that has been ongoing for nearly a decade." He paused, letting the shock of his words register. He then turned his gaze upon a pale, sweating man standing near the back of the room. "Is that not so, Mr. Fletcher?" The steward looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Alistair did not wait for an answer. "Miss Vance's work has not defrauded this family," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "It has saved it from ruin. Her competence has exposed a rot that I and others," here his eyes flickered meaningfully toward Beatrice, "were too blind to see." The revelation hung in the air, a stunning reversal. The accuser had become the accomplice, the victim, the savior. Elara stared at his back, at the strong, protective line of his shoulders. He had not just defended her, he had vindicated her. But the victory felt hollow. The public nature of it all, the cold, calculated way he had used her discovery as a weapon, left her feeling like a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing. He had known this was coming. He had allowed her to walk into this ambush. The humiliation of Beatrice's attack was now compounded by a dizzying sense of betrayal. He had trusted her mind, but not her spirit. He had not warned her, had not armed her, had simply let her be sacrificed to draw out his true enemy. The cheers and whispers of support that now rose for the Duke were a meaningless buzz in her ears. She turned, and before anyone could stop her, she fled the ballroom, the bright lights, and the man who had just saved her by breaking her heart. She ran down the long, echoing corridors, her only thought to get away, to find a place where she could breathe. She found herself back in the library, their sanctuary, but it offered no comfort now. The room felt tainted, the scene of a calculated deception. She sank into a chair by the cold, dark hearth, wrapping her arms around herself, a single, dry sob escaping her lips. It was not a sob of self-pity, but of profound, aching disappointment. He was not the man she thought he was. He was as cold and calculating as his aunt, just more effective. The library door opened and closed softly. She did not need to look up to know it was him. His presence filled the silence. He did not approach her immediately, but stood near the door, allowing the space between them to hum with unspoken words. The scent of rain and smoke, the scent of him filled her senses, a scent she had once found comforting and now found unbearable. Elara. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it, in his low voice, was a fresh wound. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the empty fireplace. He walked slowly across the room and stopped before her chair. He did not sit, but stood looking down at her, his face shadowed and unreadable in the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice quiet and strained. "More than one." She finally looked up at him, her eyes dry and burning. "You used me." It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, spoken with a weariness that went bone deep. "You let her attack me. You let everyone believe I was a thief. It was a trap, and I was the bait." "Yes." The admission was stark, brutal in its honesty. He did not try to deny it. "It was the only way. Beatrice protects her own. Fletcher was her husband's man. A quiet dismissal would have been impossible. They would have buried the evidence, and the whispers against you would have followed you for the rest of your life. I had to expose it all, publicly, to silence them for good. I had to let her make the first move. I had to let her believe she was winning." His confession did nothing to soothe the hurt. "And it did not occur to you to warn me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a quiet fury she did not know she possessed. "Did it not occur to you that my reputation, my feelings, might have some value beyond their use as a tool in your strategy?" He knelt before her then, an act of supplication so shocking from this proud, guarded man that it stole her breath. He was no longer the Duke, but a man brought to his knees. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently took one of her cold, clenched fists in both of his. His touch was warm and steady. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you ignorant of the full danger. But that is a lie." He looked into her eyes, and the last of his defenses seemed to crumble away. The weary Duke was gone, and in his place was only Alistair. "The truth is, I could not bear to see the look on your face if I told you the truth. The look of disgust, the look of fear. From the moment you walked into this library, you have been the only person in my life who has acted with complete and utter integrity. The only person who looked at me and did not see a title or a fortune. And I was terrified of losing that, terrified of becoming, in your eyes, just another man who uses people." He closed his eyes for a moment, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "In trying to avoid that, I became exactly that man. For that, I am truly sorry." It was the private confession, the laying bare of his soul. He had revealed the deepest source of his isolation, not just grief, but a profound and cynical loneliness born of constant betrayal. He had seen in her a beacon of honesty, and had been so afraid of extinguishing it that he had nearly destroyed it with his own machinations. Her anger began to dissolve, washed away by a wave of understanding, and a sorrow so deep it ached. She saw the wounded man beneath the ducal armor, the man who had been fighting a war on all fronts, alone. Her fingers uncurled in his hands. She did not pull away. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of hurt, but of healing. It was the quiet after the storm. He had made a calculated, ruthless move in the ballroom, but he had done it to protect his home, his family, and, in his own misguided way, her. And now he was offering her the one thing he had never offered anyone else: his own vulnerability. It was a currency far more valuable than anything recorded in his ledgers. The next morning, a summons went out. The entire family, Adelaide, her mother, a pale and shaken Lady Beatrice, and the senior household staff were gathered in the main drawing room. The mood was funereal. Beatrice sat stiffly on a settee, her face a stony mask, refusing to look at anyone. Mr. Fletcher was conspicuously absent, having been dismissed and handed over to the local magistrate before dawn. Alistair entered the room, and a heavy silence fell. He was once again the Duke, composed and authoritative, but there was a new quality to his demeanor, a clarity and purpose that had been absent before. Elara stood near the window, a silent observer. He had asked her to be there, and she had agreed. He began to speak, his voice calm and methodical. He laid out the full extent of Fletcher's crimes, supported by a neat stack of papers he placed on a central table. He did not mention Lady Beatrice's husband directly, but he made it clear that the steward's long tenure was a result of gross negligence and a culture of turning a blind eye, an indictment that hung in the air like smoke. He systematically dismantled Beatrice's authority, not with anger, but with cold, irrefutable facts. Her power had been built on a foundation of social terror and implied consequence, and he simply kicked the foundation out from under it. When he had finished with the matter of the theft, he turned his attention to the future of the estate. "Blackwood has been mismanaged for years," he stated, his gaze sweeping the room. "It has been governed by sentiment, laziness, and dishonesty. That ends today. This house will henceforth be run on principles of efficiency, transparency, and above all, integrity." Then he turned, his eyes finding Alara where she stood by the window. He looked directly at her as he addressed the room. "To that end, I am creating a new position, that of estate comptroller. This person will have full authority over all household and estate expenditures and will answer directly to me." He paused, letting the weight of his announcement settle. "I have offered this position to Miss Alara Vance, and she has done me the honor of accepting." A collective gasp went through the room. Adelaide stared at her cousin as if seeing her for the first time. Lady Beatrice's face, already pale, turned to chalk. It was a stunning, audacious move. He had not just defended Alara, he had elevated her. He had taken the very quality Beatrice had mocked, her practicality, her skill with numbers, and made it the cornerstone of his new order. He had publicly and unequivocally declared that her inner worth, her competence and integrity, was more valuable to him and to the future of his dukedom than any bloodline or dowry in the room. He walked over to Alara, stopping before her. In front of his family and his entire staff, he took her hand. "The estate is in your debt, Miss Vance," he said, his voice clear and sincere for all to hear. "And so am I." It was his definitive action, his public choice. He was not just aligning himself with her. He was rebuilding his world around her. He was choosing character over class, substance over style. In that moment, Lady Beatrice's reign of whispers and intimidation was over, shattered by one man's public recognition of one quiet woman's true value. Later that day, after the shock waves of the morning's announcement had subsided, a fragile peace settled over Blackwood Manor. Lady Beatrice, utterly defeated, had retired to her rooms, announcing her intention to depart for her own country seat the following morning. The social gatekeeper had lost control of the gate. Adelaide and her mother, realizing the game was lost and that the Duke's attentions were irrevocably fixed elsewhere, were also making arrangements for a swift and face-saving departure. For the first time in weeks, the air in the great house felt clean, free of the oppressive weight of ambition and deceit. Alistair found Alara where he knew she would be, in the library. She was not at the desk, but standing by one of the tall windows, looking out at the gardens where the afternoon sun was finally breaking through the clouds. The room was quiet, peaceful. It was their space, and now it felt truly and completely theirs. She turned as he entered, a small, questioning look on her face. He had won the war, but the terms of their own private peace had not yet been settled. He did not speak at first. He simply walked to the desk and picked up the heavy ledger of household accounts, the book that had started everything. He held it in his hands for a moment, weighing it, before placing it back on the desk with a soft, final thud. He turned to face her, the last of his ducal armor falling away. He was just Alistair, the man who had found his anchor in a storm. "The position of comptroller is yours, if you will still have it," he began, his voice low and earnest. "The salary is considerable. You would be independent. You would never have to depend on the whims of relatives again." He was offering her security, respect, a future she could never have dreamed of. It was a generous, honorable offer, and it was not at all what he had come to say. He took a breath, his gaze searching hers. But it is not enough. It is not what I want. He crossed the space between them, stopping just before her. Running this estate, raising Leo and Clara, rebuilding what my brother broke. I find I cannot imagine doing it alone. I have been alone my entire life, even when surrounded by people. Until you. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to gently touch her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, reverent. I do not need a comptroller, Ilara. I need a partner. I do not need an employee. I need an equal, someone whose wisdom I trust more than my own, someone whose quiet courage gives me strength. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers captive. I am not an easy man. I am guarded, and I am wounded by the past. But I believe you see that. I believe you see the man behind the title, just as I saw the woman behind the plain blue dress. His voice dropped to a near whisper, laden with all the emotion he had held back for so long. I am asking you to be my wife, not to be my duchess, though you would be the finest duchess this house has ever known. I am asking Ilara Vance if she will do me the profound honor of becoming my wife, my partner, and my friend. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or humiliation. They were tears of a joy so overwhelming it was a physical ache in her chest. He was not offering her a title as a prize. He was offering her his life, his future, his vulnerabilities. He was asking for her, for the quiet, observant woman who loved books and balanced ledgers, for the woman who mended broken toys and tamed a broken man's heart. He saw all of her, and he valued all of her. She raised her hand to cover his, pressing his palm against her cheek. The choice was not about escaping her past or securing her future. It was about stepping into a life with a man she had come to respect, to understand, and to love. A man who, for all his power and privilege, had been just as lonely as she was. Her acceptance was not a surrender, but a conscious act of trust, a choice made with the full force of her own quiet, resilient heart. Yes, she whispered, the word a quiet affirmation in the hallowed silence of the library. Yes, Alistair. I will. He closed his eyes, a shudder of relief passing through him. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of such profound intimacy and gratitude it was more moving than any kiss. In the quiet room, surrounded by books and the ghosts of their lonely pasts, two solitary souls finally found their home in each other. The poor relation in her mother's old dress had not only captured the Duke's attention, she had captured his heart, and in doing so, had found her own rightful place in the world. 2 years later, the rain was falling again at Blackwood Manor. But it was a gentle, life-giving rain now, nurturing the newly planted gardens and washing the world clean. It drummed softly on the glass of the library windows, a soothing rhythm in the quiet of the late afternoon. The room was much the same. The towering shelves, the massive fireplace where a cheerful fire now burned, but it was filled with a new warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. The scent of old leather and paper was now mingled with the faint, sweet smell of the climbing roses Ilara had planted just outside the window. Leo and Clara were no longer pale ghosts. They were sprawled on the hearthrug, their heads bent together over a large illustrated book of maps. Leo, now 10, traced a route across a continent with his finger, his voice a low, excited murmur as he explained his imaginary travels to his sister. Clara, her cheeks rosy with health, listened intently, occasionally interrupting with a question or a giggle that echoed brightly in the high-ceilinged room. They were children again, their spirits healed by a steady diet of kindness, security, and love. Ilara sat in a comfortable armchair near the fire, a mending basket at her side. She was not mending one of her own worn garments, but stitching a small tear in Leo's favorite shirt. Her movements were as patient and precise as ever, but there was a deep, settled peace in her face that had not been there before. She wore a simple dress of dark green velvet, elegant but practical. Her only ornament was the plain gold band on her left hand, a circle as simple and as strong as the bond it represented. The library door opened, and Alistair entered. He paused for a moment on the threshold, a quiet smile touching his lips as he took in the scene. The domestic peace of it, the simple, unforced happiness contained within the four walls of this room, was still a source of quiet wonder to him. The weary, cynical man who had watched Elara from the shadows 2 years ago was gone, replaced by a man at ease in his own home, in his own life. The burdens of his title had not vanished, but now they were shared, and the sharing had made them lighter than air. He crossed the room and bent to kiss the top of Elara's head, his hand resting for a moment on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her smile a mirror of his own. It was a silent conversation, a comfortable exchange of affection that needed no words. He then went to the children, ruffling Leo's hair and dropping a kiss on Clara's cheek, listening for a few moments to their grand plans for exploration before they returned to their map, their concentration absolute. He settled into the chair opposite Elara, picking up a small, leather-bound volume from the table beside him. He did not open it, but simply held it, watching his wife's fingers work the needle. "The steward from the North Riding sent his quarterly reports," he said, his voice a low murmur that did not disturb the children. "They are on the desk." "Are they balanced?" she asked, not looking up from her work. A faint smile played on his lips. "To the penny. It seems the news of Blackwood's new comptroller has had a remarkably clarifying effect on the arithmetic of the entire county." She snipped the thread, the repair complete, and folded the shirt, placing it in her basket. She looked at him then, a soft, teasing light in her eyes. It is amazing what a little integrity can do for one's mathematics. Their gazes met and held over the sleeping children and the crackling fire. It was all there in that shared look. The memory of a tense dinner party, of a humiliating accusation in a glittering ballroom, of a desperate confession in the dark. It was all there, the foundations of the life they had built together. A life founded not on titles or fortunes, but on a shared respect for the simple, unassailable truth. He reached across the small space between them, and she placed her hand in his. It was the same gesture, the same unintentional touch that had first sparked in this very room, but now it was familiar, easy, the natural language of their partnership. His hand closed over hers, a gesture of quiet possession and profound gratitude. The story of the Duke and the poor relation had become something of a local legend, a tale told with varying degrees of accuracy in the drawing rooms of the county. But they had all missed the point. They spoke of a Cinderella story, of a miraculous rise from obscurity to rank. They did not understand that Elara Vance had not needed rescuing. She had arrived at Blackwood Manor already in possession of her own quiet wealth, an inheritance of character passed down in a mended blue dress. She had not changed to fit his world. Instead, he had reshaped his world to fit her worth. The woman who wore her mother's old dress to the Duke's dinner had not left with a title as a prize. She had left as a partner, chosen not for what she could become, but for the quiet, unwavering truth of who she already was. And in the peaceful, fire-lit library, surrounded by their family, that truth was the only fortune that had ever truly mattered.